Welcome to an episode of Community Off the Cuff. I'm Nick Rankin. I'm sitting down today with Crisshawn Nelson Jackson, local business owner and community organizer, and John Penny, reporter from the Norwich Bulletin. We'll be talking about the media, everything involving the media that we can get to, be it sensationalism, journalism, code of ethics, and how the folks in the media are also individuals and not just a homogenous group. Stick around.
2836.
So, Crisshawn, you're obviously a member of Rose City United. You're the facilitator of Rose City United, and you keep everything on track, keep the meetings going on time, on topic, all the time. And John, you've been with the Bulletin for 16 years, right?
16 years, yep, right around there.
All right, so what was it? Journalism, reporting, why'd you pick it?
It was, at least for me personally, it was a total accident. I had just gotten out of the Army. I was starting to go to school at Three Rivers, and I needed a computer requirement. So I saw they had a journalism class, and it didn't involve math, so I signed up for it. And then a few years later, I moved over to UConn, and then got a job before long after that with the Bulletin.
Okay, so Bulletin lifer.
Yep. I interned for him, and then I worked for him as a freelancer, and then they hired me full-time about 16 years ago.
Okay. What did you think it was going to be when you started?
I had absolutely no idea. I think the first time I ever walked into a newspaper office, it was a night of a presidential election, so they just had me working phones.
That must have been crazy.
It was very exciting for somebody that had never seen that kind of stuff before, and it was just making phone calls, calling town clerks to find out what the results were, something that now is not the most interesting thing in the world to me. I've covered a lot of elections, but at the time it was a lot of activity, a lot of excitement in the room. It was great. And then I did a few freelance articles with, I think the first one I ever wrote was American Ambulance on Christmas Eve, something along those lines. It was a long time ago, where I just sat with some paramedics and EMTs on a Christmas Eve many years ago, just to see how they were dealing with the holiday. So
that actually sounds interesting. That almost sounds like it gives you the opportunity to be kind of a tourist in that regard.
Yep.
You get to sample a little bit of everything, a little what everyone does, and kind of come back with the story.
I would probably say probably the best way to describe how I do that is I know a little bit about a lot of things, just in general.
Sure.
I'm a general assignment reporter, though I have specific beats I've covered in the past, but that means I have to know just a little bit about everything and be not afraid to ask things I don't know about, essentially. I'm not an expert in municipal government or courts or police, but I know enough to ask the right questions.
That's interesting. I feel like that's similar to police work in that I shouldn't say the vast majority of us, but a lot of us are kind of jack of all trades, master of none, right? Like, you need to know a little bit about computers if you're going to investigate any cyber crimes, or even deal with basic social media driven complaints, stuff like that. And you need to know a little bit about real estate, because there's property complaints. You need to know a little bit here and there, enough to, same thing, ask the right questions. And it sounds kind of similar what you were saying at the beginning, that it was exciting. There was so much activity. Yep. There was so much to cover and so much going on, and you basically get to sit there. I pulled up the journalist code of ethics today, just kind of in preparation, and a lot of things seem the same to me. Number one up there is seek the truth in reporting, right?
I've got that the first on my notepad right here. I wrote them out too. It's the Society of Professional Journalists, basically, is where they have that code of ethics. Yep, and it's got I think there's 1, 2, 3, about 4 kind of main things that everything else falls under there, on there. It's not something they teach a lot outside of J school or journalism school necessarily, but they're guidelines that you try to follow as best as you can to do the job correctly.
What does journalism school look like exactly?
I started off at, like I said, at Three Rivers, so it was. It starts off with you learn something called Associated Press style, how to write. I came from coming out of taking classes in English. It's a whole. You have to basically relearn how to write things. It's a condensed way of writing. There's very specific ways that you have to frame things, that you have to give people their titles. So there's that. There's the Associated Press style, and then a lot of it is hands-on stuff up at UConn. They'd say, all right, everyone get up. I want you guys to head out on the campus, and you all come back with a story in 45 minutes, and you're going to write it. Doesn't matter what you're writing about. Go out and get a story and come back with it. That kind of stuff there.
Yeah.
Then there's the minutia of the stuff. Everything from you hit the ethics part of it. So it's kind of depending on where you go to school. That's kind of the framework for it. It doesn't really prepare you practically for when you actually get a job with a newspaper.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know about. So I was talking to Nick a while ago, and he was saying that police officers, they'll go through the academy and stuff, but realistically, that one period of intensive training, it's intense out there. That's not going to be enough really to get you through, and so there's continued training after you're on the force. And by my understanding, you'd kind of say that officers are kind of in training of a sorts. For the next 2 years that they're on the force or something along those lines. Is that...
We say 3 to 5 years to learn the job, right?
Yeah.
Because they give you all these boxes to throw things in and what you need to do when each thing fits appropriate boxes. And then the second you hit the street, nothing fits a box, right? That's why you see things like standard reasonableness. That's why we rely so heavily on case law, right? We've got the overarching guidelines. We expect you to act reasonably within them, and then the courts will review what you've decided to do later on. And that's why laws constantly change and why they change differently in different places.
Yeah.
And do you find that with journalism? Hey, we've given you the AP style of writing, and then, here, go out and find a story. Do you categorize those stories? Like you mentioned, working a beat, right? Like I do crime, courts,
Right.
fire,
So,
government.
when I first started, I found the best education for me was reading other reporters. So before I got hired, when I was looking for a job, I would read the Bulletin, I would read the Day, I would read the Hartford Courant, I would read any and all newspaper articles I could find, because that gives you a template for how it's supposed to be done.
Sure.
So you can kind of keep yourself from making some mistakes in the beginning, though you're going to make them. Plus, there's a whole echelon of editors, at least in the beginning. It's changed a little bit now, but in the beginning, I'd send in my raw copy. When all that means is whatever I've written myself. An editor or a couple editors will go through with it. They'll make stylistic changes, grammar changes, or they'll say, hey, did you really mean to say this? Or did you think about asking somebody about this? So it was a team effort to kind of build an article.
Yeah.
Something like that, because somebody would be there that would have a lot more institutional knowledge about a subject just by dint of being there longer, could say, well, this happened 5 years ago. I think this applies to it. I think we should include this. Or I think you need to call this person and get a different point of view on there. But when I got hired, I was hired as what's called a general assignment reporter, which means it covers a whole bunch of stories. I spent most of my career up north in Windham County, covering 3 different towns at a time. Municipal meetings, feature stories, schools, that kind of stuff. So that's how that works.
What would you call a feature story?
It's something that's not necessarily hard news. Like, let's take, for instance, that horrible shooting yesterday in New London.
Sure.
That's a hard news story. That's something that happened, that you're reporting on something that happened. A feature story could be doing something on, I'm trying to think. Let's say a kid giving away all his birthday presents to charity. Something that it's not when I say soft news, I don't mean that in a denigrating way because it means something to somebody.
Yeah.
You know, but it's not, you differentiate it from hard news a little bit. It's stuff that, you know, it might be the heartwarming kind of stories. It might be something else along those lines.
So
Could a positive story still fit the bucket of hard news?
Sure. I'm trying to think. I guess some of this stuff is so, it's in the eye of the beholder a lot of times because every news story is going to be important to somebody, but that doesn't mean that it's got to be a negative story to be a hard news story. Like I'm trying to think off the top of my head a good news story that would be a hard news story. You know, it
Stimulus
could be.
checks coming out?
What's that?
Stimulus checks coming out?
Sure,
Or
or a new business or a new business opening up. That's a hard news story, but it's good for the business owner. It's good for the community. So absolutely, I don't think you can call them. I've never looked at them as good or bad stories, or even positive or negative stories, just because it's going to mean something different to whoever reads it or whoever brought the story to my attention for whatever reason it was. Look, the NFA, the Youth Council for the NAACP just had their second town hall meeting last night, a virtual one, where involving the criminal justice system. And they brought in Judge Newsom, they brought in Attorney Braxton. That's a hard news story, but I think it's a positive one too. You got these young people that are taking an active interest in these specific stories in their community. So it's a hard news story I think it's a positive one though too. Just like the last one where it was community policing and the same deal.
So hard news story is like, hey, these things happened.
Correct.
They impact us, the audience, the entirety of the audience, or some large portion of the audience is impacted by these things. That's what makes it.
It could be a budget meeting. It
Sure.
could be it could be anything along those lines. It could be something that happened at a council meeting. It could be an arrest. It could be something that happens in court, or anything along those lines.
Like you should know this, and then feature stories, stuff like that is, hey, here's this thing that's also going on.
Right.
Is that like a fair way to think of it? In my head?
Sure. I think I just did a story about NPU put out a Facebook post where they were reminding residents to stop hanging notices on their telephone pole, on their utility poles on there. And I never thought about why that would be an issue there. Because you go around to some of these nails or these poles, and once you start looking, you can't help but notice this stuff. Is some of these poles have dozens, 50 jutting nails coming off of these poles, and apparently linemen, they use these specialized rubber gloves, which are good for like 13,000 volts or something. So even if you get the tiniest, pinprick in there.
Yep.
And I never thought about that before, but I'm telling you, I can't stop looking at utility poles when I'm driving by them now. Right. And they're everywhere with these nails, tacks, and staples all pulled out. That's not something that was a breaking news story, but I thought it was interesting, and it also served what I think would be a public service to tell people, stop hanging your missing cat signs on these poles this way or something like that. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I actually never would have thought about that.
Yeah.
So I wonder, and some of the things that we've hypothesized about in our meetings with Rose City United in particular, because the media comes up often, is the amount of, I guess, hard news that is negative, and what do you feel drives that? Like, is that because, hey, we're more sensitive to negative information, we ought to be due to evolution, or is that like, these are the things that are most likely to impact us are maybe, what we term negative, or I don't want to say bad news, but it's like, hey, this awful thing happened. Like, what do you think?
I don't know. I guess, like I said, I try to shy away from negative or positive when it comes to news stories. It's news, but I understand the argument when the BLM protests were going on all last year. we were getting flack for putting too much attention on those protests from people that thought that it was inappropriate. Then coverage shifted to COVID, and that's, a horrible situation, but it's necessary to get that information out. And that could be anything from, hey, here's a new mass vaccination clinic that's open up at one of the casinos, or it could be something as simple as a nurse, working in an ER or a respiratory unit talking about how afraid she is of going home to her family, and those aren't, I guess, happy news stories, and I guess they could be construed as negative ones, but they're necessary, I think, too. I don't know. I understand, I think, what the complaint is I don't necessarily think that trickles down to the local media market, because that argument's been made that the media is in the business of promoting bad or negative stories because it somehow is good for their bottom line. I don't know if that's true, but I can tell you, I've never seen that at the local level.
Sure.
It just doesn't, like, I've never been asked by a boss or an editor or whoever, or I never even heard a comment about, let's play this up because it's going to be good for us. It's just, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And we're so busy that those concerns, I don't think they ever crop up. They certainly never do when I decide if I'm going to write a story. The last thing on my mind is going to be, is this going to be good for the newspaper? It's usually, how is this going to affect somebody reading it?
Gotcha.
Is my guiding principle. Am I providing information that's going to be helpful or even entertain somebody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it worth knowing? Yeah, and I guess that's probably the thing that comes up most often is like the national picture, and I think about it, if I flip on the television, there's not a time that I could scroll past Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or you name it, that there's not alert. Like literally the word alert, and I just wondered, as and obviously it's not the same with print, right? Like especially a local newspaper. I was just wondering if you knew, kind of from a boots on the ground perspective of being in journalism, like what maybe drives that, and is some of that, hey, like we select for that, right? As an audience, we select for that by engaging with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I can only speculate. Broadcast journalism is way out of my wheelhouse, but I have to think that if you're seeing those kind of alerts on those channels, then obviously it's a way to attract viewership, which ultimately works for them. I mean, to a lesser degree, our newspaper has a website. I assume probably most of the people that get to my articles are getting it probably through their phones or through a computer. So, you try to update that website as much as you can with whatever news is happening. If there's a shooting or something like that, we have the ability to get that information up there immediately, especially if there's a public safety component to that, to say, hey, it might be even something as simple as there's a jackknife tractor trailer up the road here. Avoid that area there. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't see that's at least trickled down to, I can't speak for any other newspaper but the one I work for, but I've never seen that happen, at least at my level with that, where stories are, I'll get suggestions for stories you can't ignore national news.
Oh, of course not.
Black Lives Matter, I keep coming back to that, but that was something, that originated, or at least reared up after Minneapolis. And, you can't not try to localize something like that. Even the DC riots, for instance.
Sure.
When that happened, a lot of local media, the first thing they did was call their own capitals to find out, hey, are you guys going to be beefing up security? Is there any worries? Is there any concerns? That kind of stuff there, too. So you do see these national stories and you try to localize them. I think the one that sticks out for me was after Sandy Hook. after the massacre, all those kids out there, we were all out at schools the next day.
Yeah.
And what did we see? We saw police officers, we saw state troopers, we saw a lot of anxious parents, and you take that information and you follow it up with superintendents. Mm-hmm. What are you guys going to do? Are you guys worried this could happen here?
Yeah.
Could somebody see that as something as, well, you guys are just taking a tragedy and blowing it up as a way to sell newspapers? I don't think that's a valid argument necessarily. It's superintendent saying, here's how we're going to keep your kids safe. Here's some massive changes that are going to be happening to how we let people in and out of schools, things like that. That's the main one I can think of a national story localized,
And how does that, sitting from a reporter's point of view, like when you hear, hey, you guys are just trying to do this to blow up and sell newspapers, like, does that affect you? Does over time because I feel like we hear that sort of thing a lot. It's like, oh, you guys just have nothing better to do. You're trying to do, like, people are assigning you your intentions, your beliefs. And
Right.
I imagine, like I told you before you came on, like, I hear the media as much as I hear the police, as if it's all one.
It's a lazy way of
thing.
thinking. It's
Sure.
it's a shortcut way of thinking. That stuff doesn't bother me, but only because I'll see an individual post something on Facebook, for instance. I have a Facebook account that's hooked to, and Twitter as part of my job. I get a lot of story ideas from them. People contact me. And a lot of times I'll see sources that I know will rail against the media, but I can call them on the phone the next day and they're more than happy to talk to me, or they'll call me and say, hey, did you know this is happening? So there's a disconnect there where it's the media is this huge problem in the country, but this individual, this reporter that I've dealt with for 10 years, I have any problem talking with him. So they don't understand. It's the same, I'm sure, with police. You hear the police. The police need to be reined in. But at the same time, I'm sure you've had instances where those same people are coming up to thank you for say, hey, thanks for doing this, or
Yeah, and a lot of times it's face to face. It's like, well, no, not you,
Well-
right? And not you. It's the police. And I understand what you mean. Like, I get it. And it's-
Crisshawn you said something about similar to this when I talked to you a while ago about an article I did, something along the lines of familiarity is kind of the enemy of those kind of blanket knee-jerk reactions just in general. I'm almost positive you said something along those lines when I talked to you, and it was about seeing, I think it was Sergeant Rankin and another police officer walking down the street. You said something along those lines, and that stuck with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was basically the idea that we kind of see people as this homogenous blob of things, where we see the uniform or we see the TV or whatever it happens to be. And so in this conversation, I've been listening very closely, and one of the things that struck me is, so I'm here primarily to get that sense of familiarity with quote-unquote the media, and to kind of contextualize it and to humanize it. And so there are things that I didn't really recognize until they popped up into this conversation, like the difference between the national level and the local level. And he made a distinction between reporters and journalists. I'm not even exactly sure what that is.
And there's not. We had this conversation before.
Okay.
It's a matter of, I think they're interchangeable names. I think journalist sometimes sounds a little pretentious. I've always just called myself a reporter, but it's the same job description. I guess it's a matter of personal taste, how you want to present yourself. Are you a businessman? Are you an entrepreneur? It's that kind of thing. It's personal taste.
Yeah, okay. And so that's great to know.
Yep.
The thing is, I think that most people don't really, right? And so when I think of this conversation and this rare opportunity to get someone like you, just to sit down and speak with you for however much time we have, I really want to take this opportunity to kind of build some of that depth, right? Because we have these things at the top that we see and that we think about and that people get angry about, right, on one side or another, and there are potential views on, like, ethics, sensationalism, bias in media, and things of that nature, and that's all stuff on the surface / at the top. But there's a bunch of stuff under there called context, basically, that we don't have, and that I would like to get a better sense of.
Sure.
And so like I kind of want to go back to the beginning, for being honest, about like what it's like to kind of become a journalist or a reporter, and what that training might look like. How that might differ on the local level as opposed to like the national level. Or do you have to start local to become national? Like, these are things I don't know.
I've my entire career I've worked locally.
Yeah.
I have a family in Norwich. My kids went to NFA. I've got roots here, and I'll say, when I say here, I haven't covered a lot of Norwich until very recently. It's been up in Windham County, but it's still in the same area. It's Eastern Connecticut. I've been there, so I never had the desire to move to a national outlet, but that's usually how it works. Somebody gets their start at a local newspaper, they get noticed, they do well, they move up, maybe they move to the capital of a state, and then they move to a more national or a bigger paper or something like that. At the Bulletin, I mean, I've had colleagues that one's just got a job at working for NPR now, doing national news copy on there. Other ones have, gone to other parts of the country. So you kind of start local because that's who's hiring you when you're fresh out of school. Of course, that's how you're gonna start, at a smaller paper, and then you kind of go from there depending on where you want to go.
Yeah. What kind of things get like drilled into the novice journalist?
It's not as formalized as I don't want you guys to think that there's a formalized process for this kind of stuff. Even these code of ethics that we were just talking about, you don't hear a lot about it because I think reporters kind of ingrain the stuff after a while. And I'll just mention a couple of them. It's the high points are to seek truth and report it, which basically means be accurate and be fair. Consider your sources' motives. Why is somebody asking you to do a story or tipping you off about it? Because usually there is a motive. Could be good, could be bad. It's to minimize harm, which means you have to have a sense of empathy and compassion when you're doing these stories. And I've worked the court system for quite a few years now. That's where I've been working most recently. And I got to tell you, it surprised me, but the longer I've covered the courts, the more empathy I have for some defendants, which surprised me going into it. I thought it would be kind of the opposite with that. And then there's the act independently. That's another one, is avoid any kind of conflict of interests. We don't work for a city. We don't work for a police department. We don't work for a political party. It's a separate entity to keep all those kind of institutions accountable. And then the other one is be accountable and be transparent. If you make a mistake, you correct that mistake. You write a correction, and you make sure that you own up to it. So those are kind of the basic tenets of the thing, and they're kind of talked about. You kind of just keep that with you as you go through your career. Maybe an editor will remind you to say, hey, you can't do this story and just talk to this one person. You need to get the other side of that. And then after a while, it becomes kind of ingrained. So, you really start off quick. They throw you in there and you start doing stories, and you just have to rely on somebody that's been there for a longer period of time to say, okay, this is wrong. This is not how you do this. And you learn as you go along.
Sure. Yeah, experience game. So you said a lot of people start at that local level, and then if they're doing well, if they're gaining some attention, they might move up to a capital city followed by.
And if that's what they want.
Sure, if that's what they're interested in.
Yep.
What are the things that tend to move somebody along within that? Like, what is it? Hey, wow, this person's got a real way with words. They paint a beautiful picture. Or is it like, this person's got a nose for the correct story? Or is it, hey, they seem to investigate these things really well, like, or is it, hey, that kind of which of those things you're
I
good
think
at determines where you might choose to go?
I think it's all of those things, but again, there's so many different paths here. It could be somebody just decides, I want to move to Georgia and get a job there, and there happens to be an opening there. There's not a lot of openings for reporter positions for print newspapers anywhere around the country. There's just not a lot of them there.
Yeah.
So the market for that stuff is shrunk significantly. I mean, it's no surprise that, newspapers in general it's a challenging time for them. There's other ways people can get their news without paying for it. And the COVID crisis has hit us particularly hard with that. There's no advertising, so we rely on subscriptions now for this kind of thing. So I think that when people go to a different market, they go there. First of all, they want to be able to go there, and then you just send out a bunch of resumes and see who.
Right.
I don't think there's a lot of people headhunting necessarily for that. It's more like, I'm going to put my resume out and see who picks it up. Here's my clips. Here's what my copy looks like. Maybe I'll fit in with you guys, that kind of deal.
Sure.
And again, I'm speaking from what I've heard colleagues that have left have kind of gone through. It's nothing that I've gone through personally on there.
Sure.
You mentioned, I guess, I hadn't really considered how COVID might affect the local markets for like newspapers and etc. Makes a lot of sense that, no businesses, no advertising.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really big problem. I'm curious, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on the, I guess, the direction the industry is heading?
That's a good question. I think we're doing the best we can under the circumstances. And I have a very narrow kind of focus. I don't have anything to do with the financial side or even the editorial side, which a lot of people don't know either. There's an editorial side to the news, which is the opinion section, which reporters have absolutely nothing to do with. We don't write editorials, we don't make editorial comments, things like that. Mm-hmm. But then there's the sales, the all that stuff, which I have almost no contact with on there, except, I'm a fairly smart individual and I can see that if people aren't advertising, people aren't buying papers. So there's been a real move towards the digital side of this, and that means getting people subscribing to newspapers as opposed to relying on that advertising money, which was, you pick up any newspaper and, it used to be there would be, pages and pages of ads in there. You're just not seeing that anymore. So the newspaper businesses had to pivot to try to attract readers, and you do that, I think, with compelling stories is the only way. Is the only thing I can do on my end is to write the best stories I possibly can and hope that resonates.
Sure.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And do you notice any? Well, I don't know if you have access to analytics or anything like that, or if that's whoever the editor is, or maybe the company itself.
Yep.
At large. But do you notice trends in that changing over time? Like when you say write the most compelling story.
I used to. I get a broad sense of which of my stories have to be doing well, and I think that is mirrored by just about everywhere else. The arrest stories, crash accident stories, things like that. Those get a lot of hits.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I'll write a story which I think it might be, a bigger kind of a project, something that I put a lot of time and effort into. Doesn't necessarily get the eyes on it on there that I think it should, or I want it to selfishly,
Right.
So, and I don't know the reason for that. Maybe it's human nature. I don't know. People, if I do just a quick brief on an arrest, that so-and-so got arrested, that could get a bunch of people reading that thing.
Right.
But it,
Do you feel like you get a keener eye for, or maybe more like a more refined palette for what a good news story is by having to write them?
Oh, I know. You know what? The longer I do this, the more I have a lot of respect for other reporters that I've always read that I think do the job exceptionally well.
Sure.
I think I'm a good reporter, but I know there's people out there that do this job, just phenomenally. And luckily, I can sit there and read and see how they did it and try to do better the next time, or say, that's an interesting angle that person took. Not necessarily, doesn't even have to be from my newspaper. It's, from wherever. So that's the good thing about this job, is you've always got, it's a new start the next day. There's always going to be something to write about.
Right.
So you always kind of get a chance to do it better.
Yeah.
How much do you write?
Well, for a while, for most of my career, it was at least 2 stories a day.
Wow.
That changed a little bit when, the business goes through a kind of a shift every few years or so. They look at different ways, the best way to reach kind of readers. So for a while there, it was 2 stories, but there were days when I wrote 4 or 5 if news was breaking all over the place. Some of those could be, build off a press release. Some of them could have been an accident or, something crime related. Or there were times where there was 3 big court cases happening in New London where I would, write 3 stories off of that or something. So it really changed. But for the most part, it was 2 stories a day. That's kind of gone to like 1 story a day, and then using that extra time to work on more long-term projects, which, that hadn't happened for a lot of time. It was a lot of, I don't know if meat grinder stuff is the right word for it for several years ago, but it was content, put out as much as you can, and that was fine. It's changed a little bit where I've got a little bit more time to work on stuff that might take me a couple weeks to produce a story in between the daily stories.
That's got to be better, right? Because 2 stories a day, 4 stories, that's a lot. It's a lot to write.
It is, but some of them might have been, building a story straight from the ground up. This has happened, you got to get this in. Some of it is building off a press release that the police send out or the schools sent out, or maybe it's a story that I'm freshening up, that something happened with a story I've already written on. So I wasn't always, writing 5 stories just on my own on there. Sometimes that did happen, but there's some days where it was tough, but it's not an ideal way. 2 stories is about I think a limit to be able to do it well and not make mistakes. Because you start making mistakes, then what's the point? It's just fiction at that point. It's not news.
That, I have to imagine it's, that 2 stories a day thing is, how you'd prefer to have it done, maybe the most efficient, maybe the most precise way of doing it. But then, like you said, well, if there's breaking news,
Right.
It's not, it has to be reported. It has to be kind of handled. And I'm sorry I keep drawing the parallels with police work here, but I feel like it's kind of the same for our guys. I'm in a position now where same thing. It's like, hey, I'm not answering a bunch of calls for service. I get the chance to work on some long-term things, on some projects that I think are really worthwhile. And there's always the talk of the glory days of oh yeah, well, on evening shift you'd get 6, 7 numbers. You'd be out there just hammering out reports, hammering out calls, and you're just kicking ass and taking names, so to speak, right? You're out there just ba ba ba. And I think the same thing kind of happens in police work, where you go, well, yeah, you can do that, and you can get through the call, and you don't have a choice, right? You better do that. That's what you're tasked with. You don't get the choice. But I do think the quality does suffer when,
How could it not?
It has to.
Right.
Not every investigation could be a murder investigation.
Right.
You deal with the smaller crime, the one that actually probably means more to the victim, right? and then you deal with something a little bit bigger. It's just the bigger thing gets more
When
attention.
you're talking
It's
4 or 5 stories, it's all about triage at that point.
yes.
There's no other way to do it. You get it. Sometimes it's just the most basic information possible on what happened, and no nuance to it.
Right.
That's just the way it is. That's just the way it has to be. Luckily, that doesn't happen very often.
Well, one of the senses that I get about the whole creative process around a newspaper, at least, is that it's not really. It doesn't seem like it's one person making a piece. It seems like there's a team behind it.
Kind of, yeah. I have people that will. I've been doing this job long enough that what's my raw copy is essentially what gets into the newspaper. I have people. I have editors that are there to thank God, catch any glaring mistakes or things like that about something or correct grammar. But for the most part, I come up with my own story ideas, and I get those from a variety of different ways, and I write it, and I send it into an editor, and somebody kind of takes a look at it and posts it on there. But there is a team as far as there's redundancies and backup to make sure I don't make a huge mistake or something like that. But a lot of the times I know what I'm writing about more than anyone else. So if I make a mistake, it's all on me.
Yeah.
Which misspelling a mayor's name, getting a defendant's name wrong, or something like that. That's totally on me.
Which was interesting to me because my initial concept coming in when I was thinking like the media was that like, hey, this story came out and like this journalist is the person who wrote it, right? And then listening to you, I was like, okay, well maybe like this section came from this editor that I don't see, and then also like this person above them maybe didn't approve things until things were a certain way.
No, that's not. I know what you're saying. The biggest thing is I'll put like a suggested headline on an article. The person above me, they would kind of make the final say on headlines because, for practical reasons, it has to fit in the correct space to make sure it fits in the paper on there. And I don't always have the tools or whatever to do that. So the headlines, I'll put a suggested one on there, but the story body itself, for the most part, that's all me. I'll put everything in there. Now sometimes, sometimes I'll include a hyperlink to another article or something on there, or my boss might make a suggestion to say, here's a national story. You want to put in a couple paragraphs on this to put it in context for something like that. But that doesn't happen a lot with local stories necessarily. Maybe it should.
I would, to be honest, I know you're a local dude. I would very much like to, I have certain gripes with the media, whoever that happens to be.
The mysterious they.
Yeah.
But I'm not, and I would like to talk about some of those.
Yep.
Kind of hash out some of those things. And I'm not sure, I guess, are you okay with kind of
I don't know how I'll be as
opinion?
helpful as I can be on this stuff from my very kind of hyper-local perspective on what I can see. I'm more than willing to try.
Cool. So for me, I actually don't really consume very much news. I try to do it as little as possible. I know it's going to invade into my life. And my assumption is that the stuff that's naturally going to invade into my life is the loudest stuff, right? And some of that will be what's most important, and so I'll still have access to that. And some of that will just be loud because it makes people angry or triggered or whatever it happens to be. But because a large amount of the content is negatively oriented, and I do think that is a capitalization on human nature, typically.
Can I interject and ask you a question about that, Crisshawn?
Yeah.
Because I spend a lot of time wondering about that myself. And like when you say capitalization on human nature, I often wonder who gets the responsibility for that? The humans consuming or the people printing it? Because I do feel like there's some, you know, if governance comes from the consent of the governed, so to speak, right, then like I would imagine the press's job is at least in part to tell people about the things they want to hear about. And I don't mean tell them what they want to hear, right?
Yeah.
But at least say, this is something that you find impactful to your life. This is something that's interesting. Okay, here's more of that line for you. Like, and I think the same thing happens with social media in particular, except on this crazy magnified scale where it's your algorithm. And it goes, okay, like if you put nothing but silly puppy videos or whatever into YouTube, that's all it's going to give you back. It's not going to give you back the outrageous inflamed thing, right? Like, so, not that it's a counterpoint, but I do wonder, like, how much of that belongs to the media and how much of that belongs to the public?
My personal opinion is that there's, so if you're the individual, then it's 100% you, right? Because that's what you control, and personal responsibilities is very important for having the kind of life that you want to have, right? And at the end of the day, your own existence is yours to manage. It's your responsibility to do that. That said, in terms of practicality, I think it's on the individual. In terms of ethics and morality, I do believe that's on the people sending out the message, typically. Now, what behind that, like a message itself isn't problematic. It's typically the intention behind it, right? And so the reality is that people have a bias towards negativity. This is a known heuristic. Because it helps us, you know, in survival times. You want to care more about the lion that's chasing after you than you do the apple that's on the tree that you might want, right? So what's going to kill you is more important than what's going to keep you alive. Okay, so that's an inborn bias of ours. Also, 95 approximately % of our behaviors are governed by our subconscious mind, not our conscious mind. Meaning we're running on autopilot the vast majority of the time. We have to be. It's the only way to contend with such a complicated existence.
80% of all information has to be irrelevant in order to even function.
It's actually much, much, much higher than that. We take in about 11 million bits of information, I think it's per second, and consciously we can only be aware of, depending on the literature that you're looking at, somewhere between 40 and 2,000 bits. And there's a dude named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's the guy who kind of like wrote the initial text, I think, on flow, and he thought it was around 160. So I tend to use that number. But you know, that's an infinitesimally small percentage of 11 million bits of information. You know, so it's not even 80%. It's less than 0.001%, whatever it happens to be. Yeah. So so it's incredibly vital that we're on autopilot for the vast majority of our lives, and that also means that bias is like we're going to be making snap automatic decisions. You know, and the problem is that when we recognize this, utilize this. And utilize this to manipulate things to our own means, meaning in a way that worsens the lives of the viewership, right? Because what happens is we know that putting out these messages about these dire things is going to attract more viewership. And so by my estimation, from what I can see, that's what's happening. And that is good for the company. But at the same time, what that signals to the person's unconscious mind is that the world is a very, very, very dangerous place, despite the fact that it's the safest it's literally ever been in human existence.
Agreed.
All right. So, so I think that in terms of responsibility for them, that is a moral misstep that needs to be corrected, perhaps difficultly. For the individual, I think they also have to take a certain amount of personal responsibility to use the 5% that is conscious to affect the 95% that is unconscious.
Sure, let me muddy the waters on that just a touch. So you're talking about basically responsibility for your own life and your own actions and how you move morally throughout the world relies individually, right?
Yeah.
So you're talking about a bunch of separate companies that are operating individually and doing what they believe is right based on what they're supposed to do. I would contend, and I can't believe I'm defending the media at the moment, I would contend that each of those companies is acting independently and reporting the same thing, and what's actually overwhelming is how much the receiver is taking on, right? Like, you're really taking on the same news story from 40 different places, and it feels like 40 separate negative things that you need to pay attention to, when in reality, it's a single story. And likely it's, what's overblowing it is the amount of exposure that it's got, right? Due to separate, what do you think, John?
I'm trying to think, and again, I think at least at the local level, which is all I have experience in, is I'm trying to think of stories I've written in the past month. One of them's on a decline in birth rates locally, which is going to run this week, which I did the story because originally I thought hurricane babies with the pandemic, there's going to be an explosion.
Sure.
I found out birth rates have dropped at every hospital in eastern Connecticut because people postponed weddings. They avoided fertility treatments. I had no idea. And I wrote a story about some Plainfield girl who's Young Marine of the Year. That's a feature story. It's not a hard news story, it's a feature story. Or something about something going on with Kimley Town Council and their community center in town falling apart, and it's not getting funded. So I understand what you're saying about the negative stuff, but I don't think that falls under the, and I'll call it community newspaper kind of umbrella, because I'm trying to think of any instance. The only thing I can think of is newspapers generally run Associated Press articles. We're part of this group, so I can't obviously go out to Washington or to Russia or to wherever to get that news. So you sign on and you're allowed to use that content. And the Associated Press is, I would argue, probably one of the most respected, print outlets there is. They've had reporters around there. They present the facts, they write them. So we use some of that stuff in there to kind of get the national perspective. But from a local perspective, I'm trying to think. I mean, I guess some of the stories I've written could be construed as negative, especially, court stories or things where people are sentenced or being arraigned for allegedly committing horrible things. But for the most part, I'm getting my story ideas from municipal meetings. What's going on? What's the town council? What's the board of selectmen? What's this board of education going to be doing, or what have they done? Then I get my information from sources. Is it is it a volunteer fire chief who is getting a new piece of equipment? Is it a new program? Did the Plainfield Police Department get a drone? Things like that. Or somebody calls me and says, hey, my son just did this. I think he deserves some recognition. So the whole idea of it being, an onslaught of negative news, I can only speak for what I personally write, and I don't know if that falls into that category. Maybe it does.
I don't think it does.
But
no, and that's also, it's worth mentioning. You know, I know we didn't say it on camera or on the microphone yet, but that's why we invited you on.
Yeah.
Right? We go, okay, hey, this is a person. I think we've both been interviewed by you at this point. Probably more than once, and it was like, oh wait, I know that when John interviews me, he's going to take me at my intention and intentionally not misrepresent me, and he does legitimate local stories and things like that. And I just, not that we'd expect you or the Bulletin to shoulder any of this. I just wonder, cause
I know it is a concern.
I know I'm asking the wrong questions in it, and I feel like a journalist might ask the right ones.
I think maybe part of the problem is the commingling of what was traditionally considered news and opinion. I think you see that most with TV, national, where you have talk show hosts presenting an opinion, but the way it's, when you see it on TV, it looks no different than a news program. So I think that certainly hasn't helped. There's supposed to be a strict line of demarcation between opinion and the news side of an organization, but I think at the national level, that's an issue. I don't think you see that. We don't really have that here at the local level. You have opinion, you have columnists, and you have an opinion page writers that contribute to a newspaper. But again, there's a firewall between them and the reporters who actually gather the news and write news stories. But I can see how that would be an issue to an uninformed consumer of news.
Right.
And I think it behooves a person to understand and try to find out the information they're getting. Where is it coming from? Is it a reputable news service? And I guess there could be argument on what's considered a reputable news service, but I think there's ones that, I mean, you hear things like New York Times, you hear Washington Post, things like that. People that, I just don't, reporters, any reporter I've ever met, broadcast, print, none of them have ever had an agenda to either get their opinion out there or to, or anything like that, or to make more money for their company. Who's got time for that? On that end. But again, that's just the local media market. Maybe it's different on there, but I think you're right. I think everyone is so inundated with these things coming. It can be a real challenge to weed out what's relevant and what's not.
That's probably the primary question that I would want to find out, because so talking to you, it's become really clear to me that there is a separation between the local and the national, and that those are in a way two different beasts.
Oh goodness,
right?
Even absolutely. Just in terms of what we cover, I mean, look, the Bulletin is not, like I said, is not gonna fly out to D.C. and cover the aftermath of the riots out there. Yeah. We're not. We don't have the resources and the wherewithal to do that. So we're going to be doing stories that we hope resonate with the people in the community, and that's still, the community is a very different thing. Yeah. A story I write in Killenly, Connecticut, is not necessarily going to resonate in Norwich. Yeah. It's two different areas. It's you've got, for instance, Windham County. There's huge swaths of red towns up there. Yeah. Heavy Republican, different ways of seeing things, different ways of looking at things, different priorities, as opposed to a city like Norwich. Even demographics. How who actually makes up this community.
There's one thing. So the thing is, one thing that I really, really desire is, I guess, a news source that I do feel is impartial, right? And so I find, I'm listening to you, I feel like on the local level, I can come to a local newspaper and read the stuff and be fine with it and be like, this is what's happening in the area around me, and I don't have to feel like I'm reading like propaganda in a certain way.
And there's going to be very little controversy about coverage of a newspaper of, say, a budget.
Right.
Or is the, what's the police budget look like this year? What you're going to get is you're going to get the facts. You're going to get, here's what the budget's being proposed. Here's what they want to use the money for. Here's what they asked for last year.
Right.
Now, did they use that money they asked for last year as they said they were going to? That's the kind of stuff you're going to get.
But here's the thing, right? So those are the facts on the local level for sure.
Yep.
But the world is becoming global exponentially,
Sure.
right? And so like we still need sources of information of what's happening on a national and a global scale.
Right.
And I don't know where to go to get that in a way that I feel is, like I said, impartial. One question that I would ask you before we start to close here is like, where do you personally get your news?
That's the first thing when I wake up in the morning is I have the Associated Press app on my phone. It's no frills news. It's here's what happened overnight, and it's there. It's not necessarily. It's not flowery language. It's not. There's not a lot of adjectives. It's here's the facts of what happened. This, and this.
Okay.
That's where I get my first kind of overview to make sure I didn't miss anything overnight on there too, and I'll scan New York Times. I'll look at the obviously our newspaper. I'll look at the day newspaper. Because that's another local newspaper. This region is incredibly lucky to have. I can't think of any other town, city around here that actually has two newspapers. Reporting on the community in the area. It's just not happening anymore. I'll take a look at the Hartford Courant. It's another. They're, as far as I'm concerned, they're a local newspaper that happens to report on a big city and its environs on there. Everything else, a lot of the other stuff, I take with a very skeptical eye, and I consider who the source is, who's writing this. If it sounds outrageous, if it sounds untrue, it probably is, and I'll do a little more research on there. But it's got to the point where I have a pretty good filter of what I think is somebody's opinion about something and what's actually true. And I think you're absolutely right. I think people that consume news, they need to be a lot more savvy than they ever have been in the past, because there's a lot of misinformation floating out of there. Social media hasn't helped. People sharing things that aren't true, and suddenly something that would have been disregarded very quickly a few years ago takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And suddenly, because it's so prolific, it must be true. Of course, we all know is not the case.
Right. That's part of the 95%
There.
at order.
So I think it's incumbent on the person that consumes the news to do their research and compare. If you hear something in one place but you don't hear it someplace else, or you don't hear it anywhere else, I'm very skeptical about things like that.
So as we're winding down, one of the things that we do on this podcast is kind of give some takeaways. Everything we want to keep it local, just like the Bulletin. We want to keep things local and touchable and viable for the Norwich community. What do you think? Takeaways. What can awesome listener who's going to continue listening go out and do in their life to improve their relationship with the media?
For sure. So I think the first thing to think about is that we have this tendency to mark people as like this group, as this like blob of something, like the media or the police or the lefties or the righties or whatever it happens to be. And what that lacks is context. That lacks context. And ultimately, when you try and operate in a real world with a kind of fictitious image, there's going to be fractures and there's going to be mistakes, right? So I think the first thing to think about is that there are individuals and people, and things aren't homogenous on the field, even when it comes to like quote unquote the media. So the first thing is that doesn't really exist, which was useful for me to understand. The second thing is it's important to think. It's really important to think, right? So a lot of what we're doing is on autopilot and by design, but that also opens us up to making mistakes and being manipulated in different ways. And so like it's just important to be conscious about the things that you're consuming, asking yourself where it's coming from and why, and what you think about those things personally, and making your own decisions. And it seems like the local source of news is actually a really, really good space to go if you find that that biases seem to be at large on the national level. He also recommended the Associated Press app. Is that what it's called?
Yep, Associated Press.
Yes. And so he said it's no frills, but really, really good information / data. So if what you want is to be informed more than to be entertained, then pick up that app. If entertainment's what you're looking for, there's plenty of it to go around, and I'm sure you can find that without problem. Any other thoughts?
No, this has been a blast. This is my first podcast, or so. This has been great. I really enjoyed it, and you guys made me think too, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, it was really fun. It was really fun.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming on. I know it's, and we appreciate the Bulletin for letting you be here with us.
And they're paying me for this too, I assume. So, right?
I would hope so. They ought to. Hey, this is more community work. This goes out to the Norwich community all in the end. So, I don't know. My only final thoughts, I would actually echo most everything that Crisshawn said is kind of what I took out of this is I think I'll be continuing. I already subscribed to the Bulletin, and I'm going to go ahead and keep on doing that. And probably just stick to the Associated Press. If I really want to know global news, then I'll take the quick look at it and be done with it. And I would also, agree, and I'll relate it back to the police thing because I won't stop doing that apparently. But that's one of the first things that you learn when you're a new cop and probably a new journalist, right? Like, there's sides to every story. We don't show up and listen to the victim and go, okay, that's a complete story, right? If it sounds a little one-sided, it's because it probably is one-sided. So there's yours, mine, and the truth, and it's, I think, our responsibility if we're going to not be mentally lazy, like you said at the beginning, to look for all three of those. So I think we'll call it, and hopefully we get to sit down and do something like this again.
Thanks, guys.
So it's community off the cuff. See you next time.